This material has been reproduced and communicated to you by or on behalf of Deakin University in accordance with Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. The material in this communication may be subject to copyright under the Act. Any further reproduction or communication of this material by you may be the subject of copyright protection under the Act. Do not remove this notice.
Okay, good morning everybody. Today we're going to start talking about contract management. So up until this point we've been talking about project management primarily. And so this is sort of the complementary part of managing a project is managing the contracts that are engaged or involved in your project. So contract management starts today. But just a reminder, computer practicals are on again this week and next week. So please make sure you come along to the computer prac that you're enrolled in. But if for some reason you can't come, don't miss out. Come to one of the others. And I've listed where they are and when they are up on this slide. And also if you come to a computer prac and then you think, oh, I've got this problem either with my Gantt chart or something about the logic, I need to ask a question, just pop into one of the other pracs because Kate and I will be there and we'll help to sort out whatever your problem is with your Gantt chart. We're also going to be focusing on beginning to mesh your three documents together. So your Word document, your Gantt chart and your resources. And also talk about what should be in your Word document that complements your Gantt chart and your resources document. So important to come along and get the overview of how those three things fit together. Okay, so contracts, what are they, is what we're going to talk about first up. And then later in the second half, we'll be talking about how you manage contracts. So I guess one of the important things to remember is that project management and contract management really go hand in hand. So a lot of the principles that apply to project management also obviously apply to contract management. And as we go through, I'll point out those obvious same sort of approaches to projects and the contracts that go along. But first of all, what is a contract? So very simply, it's an agreement with a person, a company, an organisation to deliver something, and it's usually goods or services, or to do something. So it might be to apply your unique set of skills to the project on mutually agreeable terms, and there is some sort of reward. There's an exchange. You do something or provide something and you get something in return. Now the thing that we think of, the thing that comes to mind most readily, of course, in terms of what you get for your goods or services is some money. But as we've discussed previously, it needn't be money. It could be something else. It could be a simple straight swap of services. I provide my unique skill set to your project and you provide your unique skill set to my project and we call it square. No money is exchanged. Or it could be you might swap goods like vegetables or chickens. You might be paid in something like that that's not actually money. And in the first half, when we were talking about projects, I asked you, some of you, what sorts of rewards have you worked for in the past? Can anyone remember the sorts of things that came out? Beer? You've worked for, I hope it was a slab. Yeah? Often you do that sort of thing with friends, you know, moving house. I'll help you move house. I provide my services, my car, my muscles, help you move house, and you put on a barbie with some beer at the end of the day. Anyone else had that sort of exchange their labour for something other than beer? No one wants to say? No? Well, have a think about it. I'm sure something will come to mind. Okay, so it's a promise. And normally when in actually establishing a contract, you work out before you start moving the house for the slab of beer what it is that you're going to be doing and what the payment will be, the reward, before you start. And you agree on that, either by writing it down or a verbal agreement is also legally binding. So whatever the contract is that you enter into, the arrangement, it is legally enforceable. And normally you would write it down, but it could be verbal. And a verbal agreement is legally binding. So it's something you need to keep in mind. Although the bigger the project or the bigger the contract, the greater the risk, the less wise you are to have some sort of verbal agreement. Now, just have a think about the sorts of contracts that you personally are involved in. Shout out. What are you personally involved in a contract? Sorry? Yep. So rental, accommodation, is it a house, a unit? House? A room. In a house? A room in a house, yeah. So I guess you've got housemates as well, and so you've all entered into that agreement with the owner of the house, through the agent, I guess. Anyone else? Sorry? What sort of utilities? Yep, all of those sorts of things. Who hasn't got a mobile phone? Nobody? Well, you've all got a phone contract then. So that's one that pretty much everybody has these days. Anything else? Any sort of bank loans, those sorts of things? How many of you have got jobs? Hands up. Yep, okay. Did you sign a contract when you started that job? You should have. You're in danger. Okay, so when you start a job, whether it's part-time or a sessional sort of agreement, you should have signed some sort of contract that binds both of you. You're going to turn up and do the work. Your employer is going to pay you an agreed-on sum of money for the work that you're doing. So we all have contracts, although we often don't recognise them. They don't spring to mind, but we all have them. Okay, so there are requirements of a contract. When you go into a contract, then the intention is to create a legally enforceable contract. So that if, for example, your employer doesn't pay you the agreed amount of money, you can go to the police and say, or the Fair Works Ombudsman, and raise the case. And you have a legal argument for getting the money that you're entitled to. Now, for these small sorts of things like your job, your car, your phone, those sorts of things, they are relatively small contracts. But if you get into a contract negotiation between two very large organisations or companies that are going to tackle between them a big project that involves a lot of money, then it's quite difficult just to say a simple thing like, my hourly rate will be this much, you agree to pay me that much for each hour of work. Very often with a big project, it's going to take months to work out all the details. And so you might enter into what's called a letter of agreement before you start. So it's not legally binding, but it is a expression of your intention to work together to eventually form a contract. So, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. So a letter of intent may be used. Also, you need the agreement between the parties to be completely unqualified. You're both totally happy with each side of the bargain for that contract to be really legally enforceable. And there also has to be genuine consent. So if you're being threatened or bribed or any other sort of force involved in getting you into that contract, then it's not legally binding. It's not a requirement of a contract. There has to be an exchange of what's called mutual consideration. So normally it's money, but it could be a slab of beer. It just means that both parties get something out of the arrangement that they are happy with. So for those of you who are using volunteers in your project, hands up, anyone having volunteers in your project? Okay, quite a few people. Because volunteers are not paid, then there's no legal commitment on their part to do whatever it is that you want them to do. So they are not entering into a contract with you. So that's just something to bear in mind, that volunteers are not legally bound to do the work for you. They will almost certainly turn up and do what it is you want, but there's no legally binding contract between you and them because they're not being paid. So that's just one of the things to keep in mind about volunteers. The thing that you're planning to do has to be legal, obviously. You can't enter into a contract with someone to do something that is illegal, and then if they don't do it, you try taking that to the police. That's not going to work. So it has to be a legal thing that you're going to do. And the other part of that is that the person that you're entering into a contract with has to have the legal capacity to do, to partake of the contract and do the work. So during time of war, if you have foreigners in your country, then in the past it has not been possible for them to be part of a contract. So if they are members of the country that you happen to be at war with, then you can't enter into a contract with them. People under the age of 18 can't enter into a contract. People who are of unsound mind or under the influence of drugs or alcohol can't be legally bound by a contract, or undischarged bankrupts or criminals, convicts. So all of those types of people, they're not considered to have the legal capacity to enter into a contract. So those are the 6 recognised requirements of a contract. Now, just going back to that letter of intent. So this is where you hope to enter into a contract, usually over a really big project with another organisation, but you've got to work out the details yet. So you enter into a letter of intent, and it's written out, and there may be bits in it that are legally binding. For example, confidentiality. So if there is some part of a process or part of your plan that you don't want the rest of the world to know about, then you can write that component, keeping it quiet, just between the two of you, into your letter of intent. So it's sort of a mini contract within the letter of intent. So when you get to the end of the process of working out whether or not you can work together, if it turns out that you can't work together for whatever reason, then nobody is bound, except maybe by that confidentiality bit. Okay, so a letter of intent is often a really important stage on the way to developing a big contract. Okay, so what do contracts do? They define aspects of the project. So they'll specify the service that's going to be delivered or the goods, and there'll be things like in it like the quality of the service or the quality of the goods is where you would write this into your contract. So there's a lot to do with our triangle of the relationship between time, cost and quality is embedded into the contract so that both parties understand what they're getting, in what the time frame and what the cost is going to be. Okay, so that's written into a contract, but also the time frame of the project can be controlled in the in the contract. So you might write in things like after 2 months, this stage could be completed. After 4 months, the next stage. After 6 months, the next stage. In 8 months, the whole thing will be completed. So stages in the time frame can be locked into the contract as well. Also, what sequence happens? So the workflow. It can be locked in as well. And of course, that goes along with the time frame as well. It also sets limits to responsibility. So for a simple example of if you are employing somebody to build a house, they might say, right, we'll build the house, but we won't do the landscaping. So our responsibility is limited to building the house, but not the landscaping. So, and of course, that's a pretty gross cut. There'll be all sorts of things within the contract of building the house where responsibility is defined. I will do this, but I won't do that. And of course, the price will be fixed, and the price for the different stages. And the contract also enables you to stage the payment, and the importance of that we'll talk about in just a moment. So the set price is fixed. The principal who wants the job done pays the contractor, and then the contractor pays all subcontractors and any other requirements they have, like materials, out of that price. Okay, so what does a contract look like? Now, it can be a very simple contract, like that will involve essentially what can be thought of as just an exchange of letters, which simply outlines the task, the price, and any specific issues to be considered. So if you're buying a second-hand car, for example, then the amount of money in it is not going to be terrifically significant. If it goes wrong, it's not going to be probably life-shattering. I'm sure you will have lost a few $1,000s, but it's not the end of the world. So the contract doesn't have to be very complex. It can be just outlining, I'm entering into a contract to buy that car that I can see in front of me for this price, and before I take delivery, it's going to have a roadworthy certificate, and those little dings are going to be fixed. So it could be that simple. Those could be the specific issues to be considered. So the risk is fairly small in that. So the contract doesn't have to be too fancy. In fact, I bought a car just with the agreement written on the back of an envelope. Anyone else had a simple buying of a car? No? All been a bit more sophisticated than the envelope? Okay, so moderately complex contracts are where the sum of money starts to get significant. So over $10,000 up to $1 million, we're beginning to get into life-changing amounts of money if it all goes wrong. So what happens in these cases is that there's generally a standard legal document, which is a bit of a template. It's all written out and you fill in the gaps that are relevant to what it is that you're entering into a contract for. So, for example, renovating a house. It will have, the contract might be 60 pages long, but it will go through kitchen, where it will specify the bench tops, the price allowed for the tiles on the wall, the sorts of electrical goods that you're going to put in it. And you just fill in the gaps for all of those sorts of things. And this means that the company that does renovations just has a standard document, and they just take it from one house to the next as they get more and more jobs. So it's the same standard document, but just the information in the gaps is different, varies from house to house. But in this case, you might have a few more issues to be considered. For example, you would need to know what will happen if the contractor, your renovator or your house builder fails to start the project or fails to start on time. So you may have clauses written into your contract that have penalties put in there. If you don't start by a certain time, this is the penalty. Or it may even be, if you don't start by a certain time, the contract is null and void, no longer legally binding. So those sorts of things can be written in. And you can see that that's important when you've got, by this stage, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line. So this is where you need to have the time frame written in, and also the quality. And by writing those sorts of things in, if there is something goes wrong and there's a cost blowout, then it is the contractor's responsibility either to cover those costs or come back to you and negotiate with you for a variation to the contract. But we're seeing the need now where there needs to be a lot more detail and a lot more protection against the possible risks along the way. What happens when we get to those really big projects that are unique? So things like dredging the bay, which happened a few years ago. There's only one Port Phillip Bay. There's not many ships or companies that can work at the scale required to come in and dredge the bay and make the shipping channels deeper. There's no standard contract available that can just go from one country to another, dredging bays, making shipping channels deeper. It has to be a uniquely written contract for projects of this sort of scale. These sorts of projects, there's a lot of risk associated with them. You can be, well, for dredging our bay, there was a lot of controversy associated with it. So a lot of the community was not happy with the idea. There were quite a few unknowns associated with it as well. So if you start dredging up the bed of the bay, there's an awful lot of nutrients locked into the sediment. If those are released, there was always the risk that there'd be a huge algal bloom. Now, our best knowledge suggests that that wasn't going to happen, but we know there's a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen locked up in the sediments of the bay. It could have happened. So there are unknown risks that are unique to this project. So for this scale of project, there has to be a uniquely written contract between the Government of Victoria and the company that was doing the dredging. So no contract where you can just fill in the gaps for this one. So this is one of the exercises that you're asked to do this week in the exercises that are up online, is to look back at your personal list of contracts, like your phone, your rental, your employment contracts, and think about, first of all, are these simple or moderately complex or maybe complex? But also think about this in the context of the project that you're doing your project plan for. Are they simple contracts? Are they moderately complex, or are they complex? So have a think through those. So under law, there's sort of broadly two categories of contracts that are recognised. There's the simple and complex ones that we just talked about, and there's contracts under seal. So the simple and complex ones, we've sort of talked about what they cover and what the simple ones cover and why you need more complex ones. And also the fact that they may be wholly or partially verbal contracts, especially for the simple ones. But there's also that category of contracts under seal. And there are all sorts of contracts that fall into that category, but the ones that are most relevant to us as environmental project managers are ones that are things like covenants and deeds. Now, I'll just start with a deed. A deed is the sort of thing where if you're buying a house, then you receive the deed to that house. So that is the document that says you own the house. Now, if it's a contract under seal, it may be that you've been given that house. So if your parents, for example, say, I want you to have this house. We know it's very difficult for young people to buy houses these days. I'm handing over the deed which says I own it to you. Now, what's not happening in the contract sense if I give you the house, the deed to the house? That's right. There's no exchange. I'm not paying for it. I'm being gifted it. So the deed, handing over the deed, is the document that says, I now own the house, or you now own the house. So the deed needs to be written so that it is signed and witnessed, or it's signed by both parties and witnessed by a third party. Traditionally, they've been sealed with a wax seal with your family crest in it, but we don't do that so much anymore these days. But the seal is thought of as the sort of official recognition of the intent and the seriousness and the gravity of handing over this deed. So it has a bit of a traditional value to it. And it's also delivered to the person who's receiving the deed. And that delivery needs to be witnessed, so that you can't sort of say, oh, but you gave me that deed, but nobody saw it. It needs to be seen. And very often it will be lodged with a bank or some other financial institution that keeps those sorts of records. But the key difference is that there's no exchange of consideration, of money or anything else. Now, I think most people have some notion of that sort of possibility of giving something to somebody else, a deed, handing over the deed to the property. A covenant is sort of an agreement to do something to protect an area. And so I guess a common example that we have is Land for Wildlife. All heard of Land for Wildlife? Anybody not? In a nutshell, it's where you might buy a property and you put a covenant on it through Land for Wildlife that says, I will manage it in a certain way to protect maybe the bird species that are found there, maybe the vegetation. I'll manage it in some way to protect an environmental aspect of the property that I've just bought. So I agree not to clear fell it, not to build it out, not to remove the water sources for the animals, the birds, whatever it is you're trying to protect. So you enter into a covenant, and a similar sorts of documentation has to be exchanged, usually with the council through Land for Wildlife, where you agree, both parties sign, say I'm going to manage it in a certain way. It's delivered, it's registered somewhere, so it's locked in. Okay, so that's the sort of contract under seal example that's very relevant to us as environmental managers. And there's no exchange of consideration. There's no money that's exchanged. It's just a pledge. But it's a legally binding pledge. Okay, so let's think about contracts in the public sector. So far we've been sort of introducing contracts at the level of between individuals and companies, contractors doing work, those sorts of things. But let's get back to the government level. And in this case, I'm thinking about the Victorian government level, because a lot of the work of environmental managers filters down from government or government policy. So it's either directly doing something for a government agency, or it's doing something as a result of government policy. Now, there are contracts within government, the public sector. So the Premier, there are contracts between the Premier, the ministers for various portfolios and the heads of department. So at the moment our Premier is Daniel Andrews. Our most relevant portfolio would be the Minister for Energy, Environment and Climate Change, Lily D'Ambrosio, and the Secretary of our Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning is John Bradley. So there's a contract between the Premier and Lily D'Ambrosio Department, which is Energy, Environment and Climate Change, and there are contracts between Energy, Environment and Climate Change and DELWP. So contracts all the way down. And then we go transition. There are contracts between departments and their partner providers. And I'll just go to this website. So this is the DELWP website, and it just lists their partners, clients and stakeholders. So they list their partners as CMAs, cooperative research centres, EPA, local government, other state and federal departments, Parks Vic, Sustainability Victoria, water authorities, universities and Aboriginal Land and Water Corporation. And then down here, they go into their clients and stakeholders, but we won't go there. So these are the contracts exist between departments like Energy, Environment and Climate Change and all of the other government departments, which we just had a quick look at, agreeing who's doing what, who's taking responsibility for different aspects of environmental management. Okay, so contracts between government departments and areas. And then there's the contracts between government departments and outside contractors and providers. So government service providers and their subcontractors, so the people who actually they employ to do the work but aren't actually employed by the government. And of course, within those contractors who are doing work for the government, they also have their employees or maybe subcontractors. So the whole system is based on contractual arrangements, right, from the Premier through the departments, through to the people who are actually being employed to do the work. So that's an important point to understand, is the whole system is structured and based on contracts. Now, a lot of these contracts are collectively called purchaser-provider arrangements. And remember, we talked about the purchaser as being the person who has the funds to buy the service, And the provider is the person who is contracted to provide the service. And that the person who's providing the service may be public or may be private. Now let's just have a quick look at Parks Victoria. Parks Victoria has a relationship with the Victorian Government through DELWP to provide a service. So they are a government service provider, but they're providing service to DELWP. And it's just through here. And so they're funded by the state government and through the Parks Charge. Now the Parks Charge we pay in our rates. So the Parks Charge is collected every year on behalf of DELWP. Funds go to Parks Vic, Zoos Vic, Royal Botanic Gardens, the Shrine of Remembrance for the development, management, maintenance of parks, gardens, trails, waterways and zoos. So we contribute to that Parks Charge through our water, sewage and drainage bills on all residential and commercial properties. We won't go into the calculation, it's way too complex. So we're paying it, it's finding its way to DELWP, who then, the provider of the service is Parks Victoria. So that's just a summary of what was on that website. Okay, so just a nice example of a purchaser-provider arrangement. So DELWP and the Victorian Government are the purchaser, Parks Victoria is the provider of many of those services. All right, the next thing I want to think about is the termination of a contract. Okay, many ways they can be terminated. Hopefully it's the contract is carried out successfully and everybody's happy and satisfied. Everybody gets paid, the purchaser gets whatever it is that they wanted. So big tick for that one. But there's a whole lot of other ways that they can be terminated unsatisfactorily. So it may be that both parties agree to walk away from the project. It may be that the project starts, contracts are formulated, project starts, get partway down the track, and for one reason or another, it turns out that it's just not working. In which case, both parties might talk to each other and mutually agree, we'll just give up on this and walk away. So there's no court cases, there's no legal interaction, we just terminate the project. Another approach there might be that you vary the contract. You get partway through the contract, say, this just isn't working. We need to do it a different way. So revisit the contract and vary it. Once again, both parties have to agree. All those 6 requirements of the contract have to be in place. Both parties sign, agreed on a price, what's going to be done. The contract is varied. So this new variation takes the place of the original contract. Great. The project continues. A breach of contract. This is not good. It may be that the project just doesn't start. And from time to time you hear about this in the housing industry where apartments may have been proposed. People pay for their apartment off the plan, so they put a whole lot of money in and it's expected to start on a given date and it doesn't happen. The builder there's a breach of contract. The builder, for whatever reason, just doesn't start. So the contract is breached and hopefully those people will get their money back, but it's a legal case, it's a court case. So the failure to start, that could be, that's that sort of example. There may be payment delays in the project, can't be agreed can't be completed on whatever terms are outlined in the contract, there may be quality issues. All of these sorts of things can be a breach of contract because all of those things would have been specified in the contract, hopefully. A bit of a variation on the failure to start is lapse of specified time. It may be that the project isn't completed on time. Now, it's quite common, as you can imagine, and in your planning, you're thinking about the project may run over time, for it to be a bit late, in which case, very often written into a contract are penalty clauses. If the completion is a week late, then the contractor there'll be a penalty of so many thousands of dollars. If it's a month late, it'll be more. But sometimes the contractor just disappears partway through a project, so it's never going to finish. So that's a lapse of specified time. In which case, if all of those time deadlines have been missed, then the contract's no longer legally binding. It may be that a contract has been entered into that turns out to be impossible to complete. And there's a really nice example of that down on Phillip Island. Who's been to Seal Rocks? Yeah, what was there? Yeah, what was it like? So, did you go inside? Did you buy some food, coffee? Yep, had a look at a few displays. Yep. How long ago-ish was that? Don't have to be specific. A decade? Around 10 years ago? Okay. Anybody been there more recently? Yeah? And what was there? Pretty empty, big glass-fronted building? Yeah. Okay. There's quite a saga that goes on more than a decade associated with Seal Rocks. So this is the visitor centre as it is here now. The Victorian government, under Jeff Kennett, entered into a contract with a developer to build a lift that went down under the water and an underground rail that went along a tunnel under the sea to an underwater viewing enclosure where you could see the seals swimming around, and then you get in a lift and you come up above the seals basking on the rocks and look out upon these seals. Anyone see that? Okay. Contracts were signed, work was started, but it was impossible to complete. And in our last class, we're going to talk about the saga of the Seal Rocks project. But that was just an amazingly bad concept and contract to enter into. And the saga went on for a decade or so. Okay, impossibility of performance on that one. Another one is the operation of law. So something about the legal system changes that was relevant to a site like Canyapella Basin, which is up on the Murray. It's a wetland, and it's a flood storage basin essentially, but it's also a state park reserve, and it's kept. It's in a irrigation region surrounding. The farmland surrounding is an irrigation region, and the idea of having this flood basin is that if there is really high rainfall, rather than flooding the surrounding properties, the fences and infrastructure and all the property loss that would go along with it, water would be directed into Canyapella Basin, which is this area here. Now, the surrounding farmers have had leases to graze their sheep and cattle in here, because the reality is one of these floods has never actually happened, but it's there just in case. but it's also a state park, so it has reserve significance. And about 10 years ago, I had a PhD student who was engaged to develop a sustainable management plan for Canyapella Basin. And one of the contributions to the more sustainable management of Canyapella Basin from the local council, Benalla City Council, was to not renew the grazing leases on this land, because it has highly significant vegetation values, red gum, yellow box, red box in there, that all have their own sort of watering and flooding requirements, which are provided naturally in the basin as it is. But one of the biggest degrading factors was sheep and cattle going in there and grazing. So part of the rehabilitation and the more sustainable management was just not to renew the leases. So these were 99-year leases that were sort of getting towards the end of that 99 years, and the council just said, no, we're not going to renew them. So this is an example of the operation of law. No longer grazing leases available for this site. So those contracts were ended. Okay, so another exercise for you is to think about how your personal and also the contracts that are associated with your project could be ended, hopefully successfully with a big tick, but maybe one of these other less happy ways of ending the contract might be relevant. So how do you end your phone contract before the 2 years or whatever it is that you've entered into has elapsed? Yep, you can just agree, you can cancel it, but you'll be charged fees, won't you? Yeah. What happens if you just stop paying? Sorry? Yeah, if you just don't pay anymore. Yeah, you do, but what if you don't? You're in trouble. Yeah. Yeah, you'll probably have to pay it anyway. Yeah. Okay. So that's one you can think of easily. What happens if I want to end it by buying it out, or if I just break the contract? What's my legal responsibility? What will happen to me legally? Okay, so the key points that we've looked at in our discussion so far is what are contracts and what are those 6 requirements of a contract? How they help to define, a contract helps to define a project in terms of the time, costs and quality along the way. Thinking about different levels of complexity through simple ones, through moderately complex where you've got a standard format for your contract, through to a unique big project with a unique contract that has to be written just for that project. Thinking about it in terms of how contracts within the public sector are interrelated and also connect with the private sector. Purchaser provider arrangements and also ways that contracts are terminated. All right. Shall we have a 5-minute break before we get started on the next part? Yep, great. When you come back, I'll just get that circulating. Okay, welcome back everybody. So we've spent the first part of today's class talking about what contracts are. Now we're going to talk about how to manage them. So managing contracts is our theme for the second half. So in thinking about how you terminate a contract, we've realised that things can go wrong. Hopefully, our contract will be completed satisfactorily and everything's fine. But they can go wrong. And it's usually things like lack of expertise in either the contract formulation or the administering of the contract or the running of the contract. It can also be simply an ignorance of legal rights as well. So, and all sorts of variations on these themes. But it sort of breaks down to a failure of the contract participants to establish and control contracts correctly. So that's both parties, both the person who's paying for whatever the work is and the person who's providing the service. It can be a failure on both parts. So you as the project and contract managers have to be on the ball with respect to putting together a contract and also carrying it through. But also the person that you're employing to carry out the work also needs to be on the ball with respect to making sure that they can satisfy the contract requirements. Now, when I'm talking about a contractor, I just want to touch base with you and think about what do I mean. So it can be our consultant, our professional with our specialised skills that we need from time to time. That person can be a contractor because they enter into a contract to provide a service based on their unique skill set. So we're not employing them, we're not training them, we're getting them in. And they're called a contractor because we're going to put together a contract that both of us agree on and we both sign. It can also be the sort of contractor that we think of in the context of, as an example, building skills. So somebody who comes in and does work for us, maybe involving heavy machinery, building structures, those sorts of things. So the contractor is a term that we're using to apply to both of those types of people. So the risks, there are risks involved in contracts, and they're usually in the early stage of the contract development, but they're not recognised or fully catered for. And it sort of results in things like the goods or the services not being what was expected because it hasn't been properly written into the contract, or it could be a result of the contract going wrong along the way. So it might have been written into the contract correctly, the cost, the time, the quality parameters, but the contract just hasn't been followed as it should. And so people who are involved in putting together and administering the contract need to be thinking ahead all the time and identifying the risks, assessing the potential impact of those risks. So what were the two aspects, the two dimensions of risks that you talked about in your seminars in the first half? Was it the probability and the consequence? I think it was. Probability and consequence. So when you're thinking about the risk, okay, you can imagine all sorts of terrible things happening, but what's the probability? And, okay, you can think of all sorts of things happening, but if it does happen, what's the consequence? Is it just a minor inconvenience or is it devastating? So assessing the potential impact of the risks is really important, and taking risks, action to reduce or eliminate the risk. So this is something that you need to do in your project plan. is this contingency planning is essentially what it is. You're identifying the risks, you're working out what the probability and the consequence of those risks are or is, and you're looking for ways to either avoid the risks or minimise those consequences. Now, this is where the project and the contracts are sort of one of those places where they're sort of intimately intertwined. The risks of the project is also a risk of the contract. So they happen together. So when you're thinking about the risks to your project, then minimising those risks or avoiding them has to be incorporated into the contract. That's the way you control the risk, by putting it into the contract, the contingency planning. Okay, important aspect of risk management. Now, so contingency planning is needed. Now, we sort of broadly recognise three main areas of contract risk. One is to do with the contract or the person who's doing the work, and two are to do with you guys, the project principal or the contract principal, the person who is responsible for running the project. So let's start with the contractor. So it can be a failure of the contractor to do these sorts of things. So achieve the technical requirements of the contract. So they might not have the skill or the technology. Now remember, right at the start, we said that you as project managers, you don't need to be experts in all aspects of the project that you're managing. But you do need to have enough insight to be able to recognise the sorts of technology that you need and are appropriate for your project, and also the types of skills that you need in your team who's doing the project. So this is where this comes in, again, in managing the contract, and also thinking about the contractor. So you need to, the contractor that you employ has to have the skills and all the technology that are appropriate for your project. Another thing that the contractor needs to do is to remain financially viable through the contract. Now, you can help with that in the writing of the contract. It's unreasonable to expect that a contractor who may be involved in a project for a period of a couple of months to several months can get from the start to, say, 6 months down the track without being paid. So in writing the contract, you would need to put in payment stages along the way. Okay, that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that the contractor should not be carrying debt from other projects, which may mean that they're unable to, they may be spending your money on other projects along the way. So that's another aspect of being financially viable. And another area that contractors sometimes fail in is to meet the stated delivery requirements. And I put up there lack of motivation. But an example from the building industry, which is rich with all these wonderful examples, is where you often hear of shonky builders who will start a project, get part way through, move on to another project, not finish your project, get part way through that one, move on to the next one. So they're constantly moving on, getting money to start projects and go part way through, but never finishing. So they're not meeting the stated delivery requirements. Hopefully they get caught in the end, but often there's not enough money in the system to actually repay the debts or complete the work that's been started. Okay, so those are some areas of failure. And the solutions sort of come back to you largely as the project manager in doing things like ensuring that the contractor can perform the contract. So it may be checking that they have the skills and the technology to do what it is you want done. And also that you provide within the contract a reasonable payment schedule and contract price so that the contractor can remain viable and, just as importantly, is not forced to cut corners, look for ways of skimping on quality, for example, in order to complete the project. And you guessed it, there's an Australian standard to help you. So this is one of the guiding standards, general conditions of contracts, that help with things like what's a fair level of remuneration, what's a fair payment schedule, and all the other things that might be associated with managing the cost within a contract. So some of the things that you can do when you're looking to appoint a contractor is look for things like industry accreditation. And remember, the Environment Institute of Australia and New Zealand is our professional organisation. So if the contractor that you're looking at, thinking of appointing, is a member of the EIANZ, then that's sort of reassurance of the level of professionalism of that person. And probably they're going to have qualified staff working for them as well. You need to check that they're technically viable, they're using current technology, financially viable, they don't have a large amount of outstanding debt that they're carrying on into your project. They have all the professional insurances that they need so that if anything goes wrong, such as a failure of the project, a building collapse, or somebody's injured and there's legal action that involves them paying, they need to be covered, have the professional indemnity and public liability insurances to ensure that they're not financially destroyed by these events. Another really key thing that often gets overlooked is that they have experience in the work, in the type and scale that you're offering. And so this is all part of carrying forward the learning from a previous project into the current one. When you're looking at a contractor who has worked in the field that you want them to work in, you also need to look at their previous projects. Were they similar to the one that you want them to do? And very importantly, is it of a similar scale? Because expecting somebody to go up, step up from a $10,000 project that's similar to yours to the hundreds of $1,000s project that is yours is a very big transition, even if the projects are very similar. And so you want evidence of them doing work that's of a similar scale. And just as an example of one horrible one that went terribly wrong is the government home insulation scheme. Have memories of this? Okay, so this was a great initiative by the government, the Labor government at the time, national government, to inject funds into the Australian economy during the global financial crisis, where the financial industry was in meltdown. And they thought, well, we want to put a whole lot of money in, so one of the main focuses should be the sustainability of housing. And so saving on heating, air conditioning costs. So insulation, home insulation, they thought, should be a good idea. We're going to put $27 billion into the Australian economy in this area. Now, how many home insulators do you think there were in the Australian economy before the $27 billion went in? I don't actually know what the answer to that is, but not many. Not enough to do $27 billion worth of work in a couple of years all of a sudden. So the industry was absolutely flooded with work. All of a sudden, the economy was awash with money to be spent in this area. And so all of those people, lots of people came into the industry. All of those people who were already in the industry were trying to gear up to maximise the benefit that they would get, the amount of money that they could earn. So they were doing things like recruiting unskilled labour, putting people to work before they had any experience, putting them in charge of jobs when they didn't have any experience. And all sorts of corners started being cut with respect to safety. A lot of it was to do with lack of experience of the people who were involved, and a lot of it was to do with just trying to get as many jobs done as quickly as possible. There also weren't the resources available to put all that insulation into hundreds of thousands of roofs. So it wasn't just bats that were going in, it was also things like aluminium foil. All sorts of things were going in, some of which had more risks associated with them than others. Things like nailing in place aluminium foil and hammering nails into electrical conduit. A couple of people died in that way. So overall there were 4 or 5 people killed in the insulation industry, some as a result of electrocution. One guy died simply by being in a roof in an extremely hot day, so it was like an oven in there, and he died just through thermal exhaustion. And there were also something like 105 roof fires caused by electrical short-circuiting after the installations. And so in 2009, the whole project had to be pulled after people had died, and there had also been all of these house fires causing heaps of damage and trauma to the homeowners. Classic example of not thinking this through and actually scaling up quickly enough, or spending the time to scale up, just leaping straight into it. So, classic example of the industry didn't have the experience to take on the project of the scale that was offered, with disastrous consequences. Yep. Question from the back row?
Yeah, so just always been a little bit curious as to why so much of the responsibility fell back on the government.
Well, it was their scheme, and they were pumping money into the economy. They didn't think through this. How do we, is the existing industry of an appropriate scale to handle this $2.7 billion that suddenly became available? And so a lot of the responsibility was theirs. A lot of the responsibility was the business owners as well, who were not training their staff adequately and making sure that health and safety regulations were adhered to. So there was a lot of responsibility all around, which was justified. But it also, of course, we love to hit the government. So the media certainly targeted the government as a sort of single target. It's much more difficult to target all the individual business owners. So that's a very brief.
But aren't they, I just heard the other day that they're apparently suing the government now for the impact that it had on their businesses. When the government, apparently they implemented it really badly.
Yep.
And then
they just stopped it.
cut it off.
And a lot of businesses had really geared up, and suddenly there wasn't any more work. Yeah, exactly. So that was a whole new dimension that followed on as well. We'll see what the courts. We'll see what the courts say in that case.
And isn't there evidence that it actually did really well and had a good impact on electricity use?
I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised, because although there were 105 fires and failures, there were tens of thousands of successful installations that happened. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a positive effect on energy usage. Okay, so now we're going to think about the contract principles. So that's you guys, the project managers and contract managers. If inadequate specifications are, if the specifications are inadequate that are incorporated into a contract, then for all of these sorts of reasons, the contract doesn't work. So if exactly what the outcome isn't carefully specified, then the contract won't deliver the required goods. Or if there's poor data that it's being built on. Remember our, for example, costing, where we looked at our cost management and using the example of a chart of accounts where every aspect of a project is assigned to a category and kept track of. That information should provide the basis for costing the next project. But if that wasn't done adequately, then you've got a poor database for estimating the cost of your next contract, your next project. Performance standards might not be properly defined. You might have inadequate or conflicting contract conditions in different parts of the document. So quite often you'll read one thing. These contracts can be quite long, many pages, tens of pages. You might read one thing, something in one part of the document that's a bit different in another part of the document. So which one do you go with? So conflicting contract conditions. Timeframes might not be realistic. So once again, learning from previous project. If you haven't kept really good records of how long things took, then those inadequate timeframes might be carried forward. Changes of specification mid-contract. So you want to be very careful that you, with whoever you're forming the contract with, there's no change of specification partway through. Or if there is, it needs to be very carefully documented and worked out. Selection of inexperienced contractor. We've just seen a nice example of that. Inadequate documentation, training or maintenance requirements might happen. And just a nice little example of that is where there's inadequate documentation, training, maintenance requirements. Several years ago, there were some new turbines put into the sewage transport system from Melbourne to the Western Treatment Plant. Now, there are not many projects like this in the world. And so a company that I won't name was employed to build some turbines. So these are unique, and there were 4 of them. They were installed in the sewage trunk to move the sewage from Melbourne to the Western Port, because there are a few hills to go over along the way, so it's not all gravity fed. From time to time it has to be lifted so it can flow. And after about 6 months of operation, the sewage managers came back to the companies that had provided the pumps and the company that provided the lubrication and said, they're running hot. They shouldn't be. And so there was a big meeting, and everybody put their heads together, the contract managers, the providers of the pumps and the providers of the maintenance. The maintenance guys said, where's your maintenance schedule? Let's have a look at that. And they went, what maintenance schedule? And they sort of went, oh, that could be the problem. These things need to have their lubrication changed at regular intervals. And so it was a classic example of these things nearly failing simply because the maintenance requirements and the training wasn't in place for the unique operation of these unique pumps. So that sort of thing happens on a scale that you wouldn't expect. You would think that something like pumping our sewage from Melbourne to Western Treatment Plant would be very well controlled and thought out. And so just some solutions or approaches that are pretty obvious that follow on from what we've just talked about. So project objectives have to be clearly outlined, defining responsibilities and limits of responsibility. Very clear documentation is really important. And just another example here of the sort of clear documentation of contract objectives. When a contract is entered into, when you get to the end of the contract, it's time for the handover. And we did talk about the importance of the handover of the project previously, but this is in the context now of the contract. And within the contract, very often there's a requirement to document what the acceptance standards are, or the handover standards. And a nice example of this is the city of Whittlesea, where there's a lot of building going on at the moment, because Whittlesea is on the peri-urban fringe of Melbourne, so that means building is going on, extending out into what were previously rural areas. So new buildings going on. And the requirements now for managing stormwater are that stormwater is contained and managed as much as possible within the development area, the area of the urban development. So what the Shire of Whittlesea is doing in some of its higher elevation areas is putting in urban wetlands to receive the stormwater runoff from the surrounding houses, roads, footpaths, roofs, any other structures. And so when a company is forming the development, putting in roads, putting in the infrastructure, putting in the drainage works, they have to build the wetlands to receive the stormwater as well. So they do these nice wetlands. They build the roads and the houses and recreational areas all around them. They have inlets coming in from the surrounding roadways and houses, all very nice. They're aesthetically pleasing. They provide recreational areas. They provide centres for aquatic biodiversity in urban areas. So there's lots of positives there. But the building continues on. And very often the control of the building sites is not as good as it should be in terms of runoff of construction materials, so sediment and also rubbish. But sediment, as you can imagine, is particularly bad for the wetlands because it fills them in. So the Shire of Whittlesea, in formulating contracts with the developers, has written into the contract that these wetlands have to be, the specifications are very clearly outlined, and they can't be partially filled with runoff sediment from the surrounding construction that continues to go on. If there is sediment in there, then before the builder or the developer hands over responsibility for these wetlands to the council, because maintenance of those areas does become the responsibility of the council after the development is complete. If there is sediment in them, then the developer has to dig them out and start again, reset them. So whilst the development's going in, they put in the wetlands. Very often the wetlands are damaged as the development continues, but before the Shire of Whittlesea will receive responsibility, they have to be reset to the original specifications. So just a nice example of handover requirements being documented and a reason why it can be so important. Okay, so writing contracts. Ensure that all potential circumstances and events are covered. So we've just seen an example of a circumstance, an event that needs to be covered. Communication's very important. And remember back when we were talking about projects, we were talking about channels of communication. And what did we decide was the number of channels of communication between the project and the person who's paying for it. Anyone remember? How many? Yes, just one. Yep. So establishing a method of communication with the contractor throughout the contract is really important, and that should be the person who is the project principal and the representative from the contractor's organisation. And something that you're going to be doing, thinking about in your projects, is setting milestones along the way. And so these milestones are the sorts of things that are used for reporting on progress, so keeping track of time, and also tying payment to. So a project should have reached a certain stage in a certain amount of time. When that stage is reached, then part payment will be given. And in the construction industry, if you're building a house, it might be, okay, foundations are in. At the appropriate time, after the appropriate time, we will make a payment to the contractor now for that slice of work. The frame is up, okay? That's been done in a timely fashion, we'll make another payment. The roof is on, time for another payment. The walls are up, we get to lock-up stage, another payment. Fit out, another payment. So identifying stages in the contract, in the project, within the contract is really important, both for keeping track of the time, the quality, and also making payments. So you'll be putting milestones, I think we're doing milestones this week, into your projects. So another area of failure by the project principal, you guys, can be things like reliance on verbal statements. So not keeping good records of what's been discussed and what's been agreed. One of the things that I hope you're realising about project planning is that it's a dynamic thing. You may have the plan to start with, but once it starts, there'll be changes that happen and variations, and you need to go back to your plan and tweak it. So there'll be discussions, there'll be decisions made, and these need to be documented so that you know what you've agreed. So all of these points are to do with keeping good records of what's been decided as the project runs. Another area that we haven't really talked about is that the contract might not be possible to continue for what we call site issues. So it might be things like the people who are working on the job have asked you as the project principal for information or instructions, or we need to talk about something, and you need to be available to do that communication, provide that information as quickly as possible, because the project stops until you do. Another aspect of that, and some of you will be applying for permits to do work, is that, and permits take time to get. You can't just sort of rock up to council and say, I want a permit to do something and get it the same day. If you don't start that process in time, it may be that when the job gets to that point where the permit is needed to continue, it may have to stop and wait for the permit. And so both of these sorts of delay or hold up need to be avoided as much as possible. Okay, so the first three are points about communication that we've already pretty much covered. But we also need sensible dispute settlement mechanisms. And once again, when we talked about managing the project and the project team, we thought about resolving disputes. So what did we decide was the point at which disputes should be handled, dealt with? Excuse me, my voice is giving out. Anyone remember? I'm sure there was a question in the test on this one. Is that the problem solving? You don't want it to go to arbitration. You certainly don't want it to go to becoming a legal dispute. You want to handle any disputes as quickly as possible when they can be hopefully dealt with through problem solving and discussion. Now, reporting is something that you're also asked to do. And during the computer pracs, we're talking about reporting certainly being timely and very accurate, absolutely, but whether or not to report at regular intervals, like every week or every 2 weeks throughout a project, or whether to tie your reporting to milestones. And so this is just the picture of that I'm using as an example of running this unit. And reporting could be at regular intervals, like every couple of weeks, or it could be when milestones are reached, like handing in the first part of the project assignment, or reporting could happen when the first test is held. Now, to some extent, if you report at regular intervals, then you haven't completed that piece of work and more time passes before the next report, and that's after that piece of work. So you could argue it would be better to report on the milestone rather than at regular intervals that actually are too early and too late for that completion of that piece of work. So that's a decision you guys have to make about your projects. But very often, if milestones are close enough together, it's better to use the milestones than regular intervals. You need to respond promptly to contractor requests for information and instructions. You need to keep records of, good records of what was decided and what was discussed. And for that example of site issues, make sure that your permits are ready on time, or ahead of time even. And another one of the exercises for this week is to be thinking about the risks associated with your project. Okay, are you feeling confident about your ability to write a contract? Hands up for yes. One person with a heap of experience in the area has put their hand up. The rest of you are very wise not to be feeling confident because it is a specialist field. So anything that is a sort of moderately complex document, even using a standard document where you're essentially filling in the gaps, that's not as risky as writing it from scratch, but there still is risk associated with it. But certainly unique contracts is a very specialist area. And so this is a stage where you should be thinking about getting specialists in, areas who are people who are specialists in contract law to help you with your projects. Okay, so Parks Vic and Delwip use standard contracts for engaging their contractors, and so it's essentially the fill in the gaps with the different name of the contractor and the sort of work they're going to do. So that's great. That's some support for your developing your contracts. You can also buy or have access to generic standards through this Australian standard, General Conditions of Contract. There are generic pro forma contracts that you can buy and use, tailor for your application. Or you can go with writing the specifications yourself. So if you're a contractor in the private sector and you're dealing with Parks Vic or Delbert, then they will probably get you to develop that standard contract and sign. If you're not dealing with the likes of Delbert or Park Vic, you could use the standard contracts that are available through this Australian standard, or you can have a go of writing them yourself, which is a bit risky. Now, I've already sort of said that contracts can be quite lengthy documents and complicated as well. And so there may be variation across a document. And we mentioned previously that you might have a document where there's appear to be conflicting instructions in one area as opposed to another. Instructions about essentially the same thing. And when interpreting these sorts of documents, the general approach is to go with the part of the document that gives you the most detail. So where you've got those two conflicting areas, if one description is a lot more detailed than the other, that's probably the default way to go. And an analogy is when you're looking at specifications for buildings, you'll have the detailed drawings, the working drawings, and the general concept drawings. You would be best to go with these detailed drawings rather than rely on these other two. So just go with the part of the document that's got the most information in it. So when in doubt, and/or there's a large amount of money involved, get a specialist. Contract a specialist to come and help you with the development of your contracts. And certainly this enables you to keep the risks in mind, identify the risks, and have the best chance of minimising those risks. And certainly if you're talking about a big complex project and contracts associated with it, verbal agreements are out. Everything has to be very thoroughly documented. So most large organisations will employ specialist contract legal advice, or they'll use the standard documents depending on how big it is. And also a really important point is to limit the number of people within your organisation that can actually write, sign, develop contracts. Keep it to the people, preferably one person, who knows the most about it. Okay, so that brings us just to summary key points. And the key message is that part of the success of your project depends on the quality of your contracts and keeping track of them. So the written quality and also the implementation or the management of the contracts. And if in doubt, get some help, because there are specialists out there. Okay, we finished. Wind it up for today, and I'll see some of you during the computer pracs. Today we're going to be thinking about milestones and also things like non-standard work time, apart from any other problems that you've got along the way. So that's things like non-standard work time would be working weekends, not working public holidays, maybe there's a completely different work pattern that you have in your project. You only work 3 days a week, something like that. Bring them along and we'll sort that out. Thanks.